The letter was never meant to be found. It had been sealed with black wax, tucked beneath a loose floorboard in the east wing of Ashford Manor, hidden beneath 17 years of silence and shame. And yet, on the morning of the 3rd of October, in the year of our Lord 1814, Miss Cecelia Ashworth pressed her trembling fingers against the cold, warped timber of that library floor and drew it out. A single folded page, its edges browned with age, its handwriting unmistakably bold, unmistakably his. The handwriting of Edmund Cavendish, the Duke of Ravensmoor. Cecilia's breath left her body in a single shuddering exhale. The library around her was frigid that morning, the dying embers in the hearth casting only the faintest amber glow across the rows of leather-bound volumes. She had come here for solitude. She had come here, as she always did when her heart grew too full for the drawing-room's propriety, to be alone among the smell of ink and dust and old paper. She had not come here to unravel the secret that would destroy everything she had ever known. She read the letter once, then she read it again, and when she finished, she sat very still upon the cold floor in her pale mourning gown, her dark hair unpinned, her cheeks entirely drained of color, and she understood at last why her father had never spoken the Duke's name without flinching, why the great manor house had been locked in a quiet, suffocating grief for as long as she could remember. The letter was a confession. It had all begun, as so many great miseries do, with a betrothal. 17 years prior, the young Edmund Cavendish, not yet a duke, not yet burdened by the weight of the Ravensmoor title, had been desperately, recklessly, entirely in love with a woman named Arabella Ashworth, Cecilia's aunt, the sister her father never spoke of, the portrait that had been removed from the gallery, the name that existed only in whispers between the older servants who still remembered. Arabella had been promised to a wealthy baron from the north, a union arranged by Cecilia's grandfather with the cool financial precision of a man who viewed his daughters as ledger entries rather than living souls. Edmund had known of the betrothal. He had known, and he had loved her regardless, loved her with the furious, ungovernable ardor of a young man who has not yet learned that the world does not accommodate the heart's desires without exacting a terrible toll. The letter described it all, the midnight meetings in this very library, the whispered promises, the single irreversible night when honor and passion had collided and left something permanent in their wake. A child that Arabella had carried in secret, a child that she had delivered in a distant country house while the world was told she had gone to Bath for the restoration of her nerves. A child that had been quietly placed in the care of a clergyman's family in Hertfordshire, and then, as if Providence itself had grown weary of the deception, that clergyman had died, and the child had vanished from all record entirely. Arabella had never recovered from the grief of it. She had married her baron, and she had been wretched, and she had died 4 years later of a fever that everyone said was physical, but that Cecilia now suspected had originated somewhere far deeper and far more incurable. Edmund had written the letter to her father, to George Ashworth, in the weeks following Arabella's death, a confession, an apology, a plea for some form of absolution that evidently had never been granted. George Ashworth had taken the letter, hidden it beneath the floor, and had died 5 years ago, carrying the knowledge of it entirely alone. Cecilia sat with all of this settling over her like cold ash. And then she heard the front door of the manor open, and she heard, with horrible, perfect clarity, the voice of the butler announcing a caller. His Grace, the Duke of Ravensmoor. She had met Edmund Cavendish exactly 3 times, the first at a county assembly the previous autumn, where he had been distant and impeccably formal. The second at Lady Pembridge's luncheon, where he had been merely civil. The third, and most devastating, at the Hartwell ball in the spring, where he had asked her to dance without preamble, without flattery, and had looked at her for the entirety of their set with an expression she had not been able to interpret and had not permitted herself to examine too closely. She was 23. She was the ward of a modest estate, possessed of moderate fortune and immoderate intelligence, and she had, God help her, been in the process of falling in love with this man for the better part of 12 months. She had not known until this moment that he was the architect of her family's oldest wound. She heard his footsteps in the corridor. She rose. She tucked the letter into the bodice of her gown with fingers that refused to remain steady, and she arranged her countenance into something she hoped resembled composure, and she walked out of the library to meet him. He was standing in the entrance hall with his hat in his hands, his greatcoat still dusted faintly with the chill of the October morning. He was tall, dark-featured, the kind of man who occupied a room entirely without appearing to make any effort toward it. When he saw her, something flickered across his expression. Relief, she thought, and something else she could not name. "Miss Ashworth," he said, "I apologize for the hour. I had reason to believe there was something in this house that required, that I was long overdue to reclaiming." Cecilia's pulse was a roar in her ears. "Something, Your Grace?" she said. Her voice mercifully did not betray her. "Or someone?" He went very still. The silence between them was not empty. It was the fullest silence Cecelia had ever stood inside, packed with 17 years of grief, with the ghost of her ruined aunt, with the ghost of a child that neither of them had known existed until this very moment stood suspended between them like smoke. "You have found it," he said at last. It was not a question. "I have found it," Cecelia confirmed. He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, there was something in his gaze that he had never seen there before, not in the assembly room, not at the Hartwell ball, not in all the careful, composed interactions she had treasured and catalogued and privately returned to in the small hours of too many nights. There was rawness there. There was the face of a man who had been carrying a stone in his chest for nearly 2 decades and just, at long last, been asked to set it down. "Then you know," he said quietly, "that I am not the man you believed I to be." "I know," Cecelia said, and her voice caught on the words despite all her efforts, "that I am not the man society believes you to be. Whether that makes you lesser or only more human, I have not yet determined."
What followed was not the confrontation she had expected. It was not an argument, nor an accusation, nor the dramatic exit she had rehearsed in her mind as she'd walked down the corridor. What followed was a conversation. 2 hours of it, seated on opposite ends of the library sofa, with the cold hearth before them and the grey autumn light falling through the tall windows, and Edmund Cavendish speaking, for perhaps the first time in his adult life, with nothing held in reserve. He had searched for the child. He told her this without flinching. He had searched for years, had employed inquiry agents, had written to every clergyman in Hertfordshire, had done everything within the considerable power of his name and his purse to locate the life he had helped bring into the world, and then been prevented from claiming. By Arabella's husband, who had known and despised him, by Cecilia's grandfather, who had forbidden any acknowledgement, by the rigid, pitiless architecture of a society that punished passion and rewarded silence. He had never stopped searching. "And the scandal?" Cecelia asked. If it were known, if the story were told, you would be ruined, your grace. Your title, your standing, everything your family has built for generations." "Yes," he said simply. "And yet you came here today. You came to retrieve the letter and, what? Confess? Present yourself to judgment?" He looked at her then, directly and without artifice, and said the words that would later be repeated in every drawing-room in London, the words that would ignite the great scandal of the season, the words that Cecelia Ashworth would carry in her heart like a lit candle for the rest of her long and eventful life. "I came," said Edmund Cavendish, Duke of Ravensmoor, "because I am guilty of loving unwisely, of sinning against convention, of failing a woman I ought to have protected, of searching for absolution in all the wrong places for 17 years, and guilty," here his voice dropped to something barely above a murmur, barely above the sound of the cold wind pressing at the library windows, "of loving you, Miss Ashworth, without permission, without hope of it being welcome, entirely, irrevocably, and without the slightest intention of ceasing." The judgment came 3 weeks later. Not from a magistrate, not from the House of Lords, though several of its members had opinions on the matter. The judgment came from a drawing-room in Grosvenor Square, assembled by Lady Harcastle, the self-appointed moral arbitress of the ton, who had obtained a copy of the letter through means no one ever satisfactorily explained, and who had read select passages aloud to an audience of 40 before Cecelia Ashworth had arrived, uninvited, unannounced, and entirely without the accompaniment of a chaperone, to stand in the center of that gilded room and face the assembled verdict of the world she had been raised to inhabit. They expected her to be ashamed. They expected tears, or silence, or the crimson humiliation of a young woman undone. What they received instead was Cecelia Ashworth, straight-backed and clear-eyed, in her finest deep blue gown, with the original letter in her gloved hand, and a declaration that silenced the room so completely that the ticking of the mantel clock became audible. "You have judged the Duke," she said calmly, to Lady Harcastle, to all of them. "You have read his sin aloud and found him wanting. You have not, however, considered the full evidence. The full evidence is that this man spent 17 years in quiet penance, that he searched without ceasing for a child society told him to forget, that he arrived at my door not to hide, but to confess, to me, who had every reason to condemn him. I find," she continued, lifting her chin to the precise angle that her aunt's portrait, had it still been hanging in the gallery, would have recognized as characteristic of the Ashworth women in their finest moments, "that I cannot condemn him. I find him guilty only of love, and I find myself," she finished softly, "in precisely the same condition." Edmund was in the doorway behind her. No one knew how long he had been there. The scandal, as scandals do, ran its course. It burned bright and hot, and then faded to embers, replaced by newer outrages, more recent improprieties. The Duke of Ravensmoor married Miss Cecelia Ashworth in December, in a small ceremony attended only by those whose opinion they valued, which was not many people, and which they did not consider a loss. The child, Arabella's child, Edmund's son, was found at last the following spring, a quiet young schoolmaster in Hertfordshire, with his mother's eyes and his father's bearing, who wept when he read the letter, and who stood at the Ravensmoor estate that summer and looked out across the grounds he had never known he was heir to. And in the East Wing library, the loose floorboard was repaired. Over it they placed a reading chair, broad and deep, and positioned perfectly to catch the morning light. Cecelia spent many hours in it in the years that followed, reading and thinking and listening to the comfortable sounds of a house that had finally, at long last, made its peace with its own history. The letter she kept, not hidden, not buried, framed on the wall above her writing desk, where she could see it every day. A reminder that the truth, however long it is confined, has a way of finding the light, and that love, however guilty, is never entirely without grace.